started. I just have a few little introductory things to say. First, just like super practical things. David Dunn is sitting in the back row. Music Sounds, welcome again. And Letitia Sanami also arrived last night. She's in a meeting now, but will be coming in a little later, so you can all say hello soon. I sent out a little introductory email to everyone about Christer Hennix, so maybe I won't go into too much of her biographical details, because I think you've probably all seen that to a certain degree. Christer is going to talk today about the question of music and the uncanny, and I thought that I might offer a slight preface to that discussion. On the one hand, I think the way the discussion will be kind of positioned at a later point today has to do with the kind of operatic situation of contemporary music, sort of a kind of problematic still stand of contemporary music in the last 30 years, which is something Christer and I have talked about a lot. We did an interview together in the last few years. And part of that also comes oddly, or maybe another, well, okay, different way of explaining that. Part of what we've been really trying to do a lot in Music Sound here is to offer and develop different ways of speaking about and understanding music, which is normally so often considered to be this kind of thing outside of language or outside of thought or beyond thought. So we've been very much dealing with that. And one of the vocabularies that is, I think, very important for Christer Hennix, but also for me personally, is a certain reading of psychoanalysis. And what that also means is a certain kind of conception of the theory of mind, which I think Christer will be elaborating on in a minute. But I found just last night when I was thinking for a moment about this, at the very opening of Freud's outline of psychoanalysis, this is his final unfinished text. This kind of interesting opening where he sort of sketches out certain premises about a theory of mind, which I thought might be sort of sympathetic to Christer's project. So I just wanted to read this little quotation. He says, psychoanalysis makes a basic assumption, the discussion of which is reserved to philosophical thought, but the justification for which lies in its results. We know two kinds of things about what we call our psyche or mental life. Firstly, its bodily organ and scene of action, the brain or nervous system, and on the other hand, our acts of consciousness, which are immediate data and cannot be further explained by any sort of description. Everything that lies between is unknown to us, and the data do not include any direct relation between these two terminal points of our knowledge. If it existed, it would at most afford an exact localization of the processes of consciousness and would give us no help towards understanding them. And I think this is an incredibly interesting and prescient comment of Freud in the light of a lot of recent sort of neurochemical, neurophysiological research, sort of pointing out a basic philosophical problem in the premises of a lot of this work, which I think Christer will get into. And then one other just kind of sort of slightly prefacing remark about the psychoanalytic discourse is doing it in English. There are certain language complications. So, I mean, today Christer's been consciously using the word Unheimlich, the German word, which by James Strache's translation is the kind of first complete classic Freud translation in the early 20th century. He translates as uncanny, which is sort of like a denotatively precise, but sort of like common usage, imprecise translation. And this problem of this sort of slippage between denotative meaning and other forms of meaning is also something that Christer is very much going to get into. And the problems of this kind of translation are like, a Freudian terms is much, much more manifold. I thought of just one other example, is a very important Freudian term, Objektbesetzung, which is by James Strachey, the same translator, rendered as object cathexis, which is a word that probably most people don't really know in their common usage, which again is sort of denotatively correct, but which doesn't have any of the kind of everyday connotation of what Freud means by this, in the sense of, the word Besetzung nowadays is most often associated with occupation and occupy, or a squat in Germany is a besetztes Haus. And this is a totally different implication than object cathexis. And so the kind of basis of these fine differences, especially when applied to music, is I think something that Christopher is going to get into. And I think you were going to talk for a while, maybe build up some terms on your own, and then I might interject at certain points as time demands or as you like. So, Mr. Hennix.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, so this is actually a very nebulous, rather difficult topic, although it may sort of look like we are very familiar with everything. And so I like to begin by sort of giving you a certain perspective or distance to the topic in order to free you from ideas that you may otherwise have about this subject matter. So you may think I'm going way outside the subject matter, but I'm actually not, and you will find that it actually coheres in the end. What I have written here is sort of versions of the title of this talk. So one way of labeling this talk is by pointing out that sounds can operate or function as signifiers. That means that sound then acquire meaning. But you can also have signifiers as sounds, which means that now sound is the material medium in which the signifier emerges. And in psychoanalysis, signifiers are primarily words, spoken words, because the analytic session consists in the analysand speaking to the analyst who is listening. But this also can be generalized to music, insofar as we think that music has a meaning. Music compositions are given titles, which are supposed to mean something. In fact, they are supposed to mean what the sound is about. And in that sense, there is meaning attributed to music, although nobody really has any intelligent thing to say about it. I mean, most of the time you get very silly remarks about the meaning of music. And I will try to avoid that silliness here today by using a vocabulary which I get from science. I actually come more from science than from music in terms of my theory. And I find that a better vocabulary in what is known as fundamental philosophy in Europe, the French people like that. So another way of expressing this topic in terms of what the role of music in this context is to say that we are going to go from music for the mind. In other words, when you are a passive recipient, to music of the mind, when the music is produced by your mind. I don't know if we get to that part, because I consider autoacoustic emissions as music of the mind. We may not get to that part. But in any case, either way, this is a process when sounds become signifiers. They acquire meaning. Now, and meaning is, of course, something that takes place in our minds. And we would think that, since we can speak, we will understand what we say and what meaning is and what our minds are. Then it turns out that this is called the big problem. In other words, the most difficult problem science ever has faced. So they have no clue what the mind is. And neither have we. Okay? Which is sort of difficult to really come to terms with. However, to give you a kind of perspective then, I'm using this title third year so far. My Victor Feldman, some music piece recorded on my stage a long time ago. So you have the other version is so far, so near. And what is so far and so near? Well, it is the universe, of which we actually have a drawing today, diagram. Well, yeah, it's a blob here, it's an oval, or something like that, and this is supposed to be the spectrum of the background, microwave background radiation, okay? So this is the edge of the universe. It's the halo that surrounds the universe. And people know a whole lot about this. Not very much, of course, but some. So this is something very far away, but it is very near to us because we have all this data. Now, and that is called science. Now we go to something very near. What's in here? It's actually very far away. Yeah, no, but this is really important. I mean, it's not just a funny thing. This is what makes this so difficult. In other words, we carry the mind with us all the time. We do everything with our minds. We blame the mind for all humanity's problems. And so the mind is something that nobody can avoid. And yet we know so very little about it. And so I thought I start to tell you something about what I think is a perspective here. So I have written some parts here not to get totally lost. So if you can bear with me as I read some of this. So we are looking for the mind, and as I just said, we have recently obtained a drawing of the universe. And this microwave spectrum goes back to the time of the very early universe. Is there a way, by the way, to get some light here? I can hardly see my text. Can somebody turn on the light, please? Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So the microwave spectrum goes back to the time of the very early universe, which can be observed after any time of what is known as the acoustic peak, when space became transparent to light. Do you all know what the acoustic peak is?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, as music students, you should know that. So this is when the idea is that before the acoustic peak comes, the universe is a ionized cloud, and is basically just hydrogen. But the electrons and the protons are separated, and so light can actually not go through. A photon cannot go through, so it's closed for observation. We cannot see beyond that part. And this is driven by a kind of wave, pressure wave, which would be then an acoustic wave in a general sense. And when this plasma, when it sort of cools down, the electrons and the protons come together, and you get hydrogen atoms and hydrogen molecules. And now light can go through. And that is called the acoustic peak. And I have a tendency to relate that to the Rig Veda, if you know the word Om, which is considered to be the very sound of the beginning of the universe. So if you're so inclined, you can think of the acoustic peak as a physical representation of Om, which is the sound of all sounds. Now the history of this universe can be observed in its entirety from that moment on, from the transparency to light. as if the universe continuously remembers itself but knows nothing about its future. Now contrast that with the fact that there is no drawing of the human mind. I mean, the diagrams we have are not very much improvement on this blob. I mean, there is some better drawings, but they are all inadequate and absolutely not convincing. So while science can embrace cosmos and the subatomic world without being impeded by affect or even anxiety, as soon as the topic turns to the human mind or its models, everything turns speculative and affect. And affect dominates, or even anxiety dominates, both the approach and its discourse. So on the one hand, it can be argued that mind belongs to the anatomy of the human body, no less than do the brain and the central nervous system. Descartes claimed that the pineal gland was the anatomical home of the human mind, if you recall. And to this day, brain research holds finding the location of the human mind and its extension as its holy grail. Okay, that's one branch of science. Another branch of science holds that mind itself has no extension, and that its appearance is an emergent consequence of our anatomy. Mind as a weightless and odorless object is quite suitable for treatment by the exact sciences. Very clean stuff. Mind as an endless expanse into the finite. But now, as it turns out, the choice between these two classes of models of mind, the one of having mind as being located, having an extension, and the other as an ephemeral, non-localizable object, is actually a choice of aesthetics. Yeah, I will elaborate on that. A preference relation based on distinct ethical concepts of what a mind must be. Because there is a prejudice about what our mind is. Very similar to the prejudice about, say, what our sexuality must be. So there is a connection here, but I don't want to go into that today because we only have 2 hours. So, let's see where is that. I come to the next one. So it probably comes as a surprise to many to learn that models of the human mind pose ultimately an aesthetical problem, which is not always appreciated for what it says about our powers of introspection. Again, we want nice thoughts. So if the thoughts are disturbing, that is not so nice. So we avoid introspection when things don't become nice. And that was understood already by, say, Mary Shelley, who devised the first fictional portrait of a model of mind that no scientist would want to repeat, but rather avoid or even forget. Because Frankenstein's monster mind is a poster child for everything that can go wrong with science, okay? And the fact that the mind can be monstrous has since the 19th century plagued all scientists and philosophers' attempts to explain mind's essence, which is not expected to be anything short of extraordinary. And I use the term extraordinary as my translation of Unheimlich, for reasons I will explain later. After all, mind is supposed to have a residency in the brain, which is the most complex structure science ever has faced. Mind and brain are both extraordinary phenomena, which increasingly are getting the attention of many sciences, from the most exact sciences like physics and mathematics, to the least exact sciences such as medicine and ethics. And on closer analysis, it turns out that many of the ethical problems raised by the recent emergence of synthetic biology and artificial intelligence are in essence aesthetical problems. Because it's all about the question, what do we want a model of mind to look like, with emphasis on look. It has to look a certain way. So there is an aesthetical criteria here. However, this very question implies that there are models of mind which, regardless to their veracity or realism, we just don't want to look at. Here the tables are suddenly turned, and an aesthetical problem now gives rise to an ethical problem, which is also a social problem, as illustrated by society's segregation of people whose minds are not a desirable feature of the social fabric, and are on that account deliberately hidden in various institutions. These segregated people are faulted, and I describe this in these terms so you understand the perspective I'm trying to give. These segregated people are faulted by representing the wrong mind, if you can believe that there is such a thing, and for which a model is desired because the desired model has to have some type of it needs to be admired in the sense that it's perceived as the crown of creation, rather than being a showcase for creation's failures, which segregated people are signifying. Here you have a borderline case where a social prejudice is in essence aesthetical, namely, who do I prefer as my neighbor? But which is treated as an ethical problem, and not infrequently as a problem for the Justice Department and human rights organizations. So given that this preference relation or aesthetics is operative on all levels, it becomes more than obvious that any desired model of mind is an aesthetical object, or even a theological object, okay? Which not only presupposes that the model is adequate to itself, but that the very mind it models is no less adequate not only to itself, but also to its admirers. For example, consider that for some people, Einstein's brain, preserved in formaldehyde, has become an object of veneration, a relic transmitting a irreplaceable myth of science. Okay? So to summarize, the difficulties which beset any model of mind are not only a lack of knowledge of mind's material substance, a scientific problem, but a persistent ambivalence or weariness towards even approaching the object as it is supposed to be. Because after all, we simply don't know what mind is. It is an object yet to be discovered, an object in hiding to be uncovered, while nonetheless it is paradoxically never absent from our search for it. A search which seems inherently biased by affect or lack of objectivity, which is a straitjacket of subjectivity. So if affect serves as an impediment to objectivity, as an epistemic defect, this raises a larger question, namely, can mind be conceived as an aesthetical object other than by what is just affect? Is this an intrinsic limitation of our intuition, or is there a way out? That is a topic that Bill and I will try to resolve when I'm through with this introduction. Yeah. So, as science will tell us, the 3-pound universe, your brain, is the most complex object ever encountered and studied by scientists. As such, that must be considered a rather recent discovery and totally unanticipated. To put things in perspective, recall that the ancients found no grounds for problematizing mind as such, and although possibly muddled by the scholastics, Descartes revived the concept of mind as the locus and agency of distinct and clear ideas. Yeah, we can laugh at that today. Today's theory of mind, however, doesn't decompose into distinct and clear ideas. So, is it a science to pursue this? And even if it were a science, thus its premises enables it to answer its own questions. The very fact that we lack a clear and distinct idea of the human mind should alert us to the possibility that there may not be a scientific theory of mind. And I submit the reason for that is that such a theory has to stay clear of what Freud called the Unheimlich, the uncanny, the extraordinary. Something it is of course bound to have difficulties to avoid. It is for the very same reason that psychoanalysis cannot be a science, since its very field presupposes encounters with the Unheimlich, the uncanny. Experimental music, when operating in the zone of forbidden acts of signification, is no stranger either to encounters with the Unheimlich, except in certain cases, which should be regarded as paradigmatic. The experience with this encounter returns the listening subject to a space of emotions which feel Heimlich in more than one sense of the term. The traversing of this multi-sense trajectory illustrates in an Unheimlich way, which we need to grapple with, Freud's etymological study of the word pair Heimlich, Unheimlich. And here you cannot use canny and uncanny, that doesn't work at all. So that's why I call it extraordinary, and then Heimlich would be extraordinary, where extra works as the negation particle. So I do a double negation elimination. Not A is equivalent in classical logic to A. So you eliminate negation by doubling it. So among the possible meanings of Heimlich, I like to mention that it can also mean secret, a meaning for which any public act of signification is forbidden and indeed repressed as repressed. So I have to drink some water.
I can just maybe interject just that, the literal words of Unheimlich and Heimlich are just very common German words, obviously. Heimlich having to do, the Heim is the home, so there's something of the homely or the known or the comfortable, and the Unheimlich is the opposite of that. But in this text of Freud, it opens with this incredible 7-page quotation, or even longer quotation of the kind of etymology of this word, where he basically traces a line where these two words basically reverse their meanings historically, and where there can be this kind of slippage between the negation and the affirmative form.
Right, and in your home you can have secrets, so to speak, for those who don't live in your house. So Heimlich, to be at home, means that you can actually protect secrets, as long as they don't slip outside the door. So, therefore, this repressed meaning is intended then to, the Heimlich, the secret meaning is intended to be known only to a few, and whose attendant signifier may remain unwritten, even unpronounced. So to unsecret, de-secret, a secret may reveal something unheimlich, uncanny, something unexpected, something alien. So beware of what you wish for, as the saying goes. Now returning to the obstacles meeting a theory of mind, no one wants to discover something unexpected in this particular field. Rather, it is safer to conduct experiments which confirm the ordinary, common sense concept of what we should expect of our minds. But if our minds harbor secrets, they can never be discovered by science as presently practiced. In other words, what psychoanalysis and art can contribute is that it provides, it offers tactics of attention for things which are unsaid and unheard in culture. It gives another opening to what we don't know. So we know that psychoanalysis has a reputation for having unlocked some such secrets, which unsurprisingly, of course, has earned it some notoriety. By contrast, experimental music, despite its notoriety, has so far failed, in my opinion, to contribute to the unlocking of the secrets of mind. And I mention this because you may not know this, but scientists who work with models of mind, they often rely on music as a test case. Yeah, music is used as a probe, you may say, to look at structures they assume to be present in the mind. So, in other words, the scientist welcomes music as a probe of the mind, and the composers don't care about it. I'm on the side of the scientist also as a composer. And I think the future of music should relate more to, not just music for the mind, but also music of the mind. And I think one of the reasons maybe we have this stagnation of contemporary experimental music is that this step has not been taken. Compositions are supposed to have a beginning and an end, and not be too long and not be too complicated and all those things. And if you have such a prejudice about what a composition is, you can never get anywhere. Yeah, truly. So okay. So that was sort of a rough introduction to why you would consider a theory of mind in terms of a theory of music, or why mind is something interesting to music. So now I thought to be a little more technical and talk a little bit about semiotics. And you probably will think, okay, so this is continental philosophy, but it is not. I'm going to do another version of it. Because the continental version is not very coherent. So the semiotics of sounds has to work another way in order to be interesting. Because sounds are related to objects and actions. Okay? And objects and actions beget signifiers. Do you see what I mean by that? In other words, when you see an object or an action is going on, you interpret it. And that requires that you have a signifier for it. And what you interpret is the signifier, not the action. But the action is supposed to help with the semantics. So signifiers are actually generators of denotations. And just to make clear what I mean by that. Oops, here goes the wireless thing. Here comes the technician to help me with this. Maybe we should take it from my starting point.
Yeah, it's gone all wrong.
So, what I mean by the notation is the following. You have two signifiers, alpha and beta, such that this is the notational connection between alpha and beta, and it is to be read so in the following way. Every value of beta is to be a value of alpha. Okay? So alpha can have more than one value, depending on the values of beta. If beta has more than one value, so will alpha. And I emphasize the concept of value here. So semantics is a way of giving an evaluation to a syntactic construction. It interprets it. You see what I mean, or not?
It's 1-1.
What do you mean 1-1?
Both directions. Every B is every alpha is a beta, every beta is an alpha.
No.
No, okay.
No.
Okay.
No, so, no, the point is that beta, if you know set theory, beta will be an element of alpha.
Okay.
This is the reverse. You know set theory here?
No.
Do I see it as a hierarchy? Or
No hierarchy. No. This is very simple atomic. This is an atomic statement in this. So alpha is a collection. It stores meaning. It's a signifier, and it has a storage of meanings. We call them beta. And so therefore beta contains the elements which alpha is made up of. It's made up of a set of meanings. And I want to be this abstract in order for you not to get confused with particular examples, because then it becomes too vivid how trivial this actually is. So, so having working with this idea, you can see that the signifier defines an object by itself. So a signifier is simply an object, alpha. And the signifier object alpha. Yes. I should actually put this here. So you have an object which I give index alpha to call it an alpha object. It's just any object which serves this relation. And so the meaning here is also an object. So all of this stuff are objects. Signifiers are objects in an abstract sense. In particular, if you take sounds as objects, because they are very ephemeral, I mean, they disappear. They don't remain after they have been pronounced. So it's all gone. And objects and actions have values to the extent we perceive them mediated by their respective signifiers. Okay? So anything you see or an action going on, you attach a value to it. but the value is not necessarily a numerical value or anything like that. It's just some type of value that allows it to slip into a semiotical system. And signifiers emerge in the environment where signifiers already exist, so they don't just emerge out of nothing. They only emerge in a context where other signifiers also occur. And why is this then so interesting for psychoanalysis? That is because, according to Lacan, the unconscious is organized as a language, meaning it is a storage for signifiers. So it follows that consciousness is organized as a recursively enumerable set of grammatical production rules. What is a recursively enumerable set? It's an infinite set. And you can enumerate each member, the first member, the second, the third, the fourth, all the way up to infinity, if you go that way. And you may know that already in the 50s, Noam Chomsky showed that the set of sentences of English, say, is a recursively enumerable set. So any speaker of English is dipping into a path towards the infinity because there is no end to what you can say. I mean, only life, your lifespan will determine how much you will say before you perish. So that is a controversial statement, of course, that the unconscious is organized as a language, because we don't really know what the unconscious is, but it's an hypothesis that if the unconscious exists, then it is organized as a language.
Can you explain recursive?
Sorry?
Can you explain you recursive?
Wait a minute, the rain is invading my hair.
You used the word recursive
Yeah.
before, like a recursively numerable or enumerable language. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I just did it.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Oh, so well, it literally means that in several sentences you can enumerate them. The first sentence, the second, the third, the fourth, all the way. It just means that you can give a list of them, but the list is unending.
And maybe just to connect the two vocabularies you're using, when you start introducing the psychoanalytic terms like unconscious and conscious, to what relationship they would have to the very general idea of mind that you were talking about.
Yeah, can you say that again?
Just as a procedural thing of connecting the two vocabularies you're using. Now you've introduced the psychoanalytic ideas of the unconscious and conscious, and just in terms of the general relation of the mind that you're describing. So if you're using like the language, the unconscious, which is structured like a language according to Lacan, if that unconscious is sort of equivalent to what you're describing as mind here.
Well, no, the two together. In other words, plus maybe more. So mind consists of two parts at least, the consciousness and the unconsciousness. Consciousness, say for English-speaking people, is a vocabulary that is, or sentence productions which are potentially infinite, recursively enumerable. But according to Lacan, also the unconscious is dipping into the infinity because it stores signifiers as a recursively enumerable set. So both parts of mind here are thought of as having, so to speak, infinite depth. So we are on top of this structure and we can descend. And there's no end to how far down we can descend. But of course we come only finitely many steps down before we die. That's just how it is. You can have computers maybe go forever and they get further, but even so, our universe will expire in 35 billion years according to the last estimate. So even then, there will be no real infinity of sentences. Now, the next thing here, Lacan says, And this is really difficult. But I like to lay it on you because it's actually very important. And well, you know, I thought about this for 40 years. I'm not finished yet. And I assume that none of you will do better. But it's very interesting. So therefore, I mean, I offer this to you to think about. So this is what Lacan says. And fasten your seatbelts. A signifier presents or poses as a subject for another signifier. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I wrote it down actually, so you will be able to not lose the sentence, the definition. So what does this really mean? Well, you have to think about the semantics for a dialogue, discourse semantics. So now only I am talking and you don't speak back to me, but in a more normal situation we would have a conversation. And so I give you a signifier and you give me one back. Okay? You reply to me, your response. And in this sense, you can maybe see how this could work. Namely that the signifier I present to you is actually a subject for your signifier to give to me. And that signifier that I receive goes now to another subject, which is still me. In other words, this is like a spectrum of subject. The subject is divided, not just in two parts, but in any number of parts. Okay? And what divides the subject is the signifier. So as you expose yourself to signifiers, the subject that you present is keep being divided all the time. So in other words, you modify yourself as the conversation continues. And so this is another subject now presented to a third signifier, which was my reply to this signifier. And I make these dots here because this goes on forever, so until the dialogue is over, okay? But each time we do exchange signifiers, it means that the signifier is being presented as a subject for another signifier. And in discourse semantics, I like to emphasize this very much because it is usually overlooked. Namely that meaning is not canonical. The notations are not really canonical. Because given any signifier, it holds one meaning for me, but most likely another meaning for you, and a third meaning for everybody else. So in other words, the reason we can be creative when we speak to each other is because we are using only the physical appearance of the signifier as an object is the same. Its interpretation differs depending on the history of the subject being presented. And here I like to introduce, when I use two German terms here, Unheimlich, Heimlich was one set, and then there is only one more I will use here, and that is what Freud calls Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. And I have tried to translate that word many times, and the best I can come up with is the notational aspect. So it's an aspect of meaning. I will elaborate in a moment. So that is basically how the level. See, in other words, this is not Chomsky semantics. This is not Montague semantics. This is a very peculiar semantics that you don't learn in linguistics. It's a Freudian Lacanian semantics which is peculiar to them. And what you're supposed to notice, one interesting thing to notice here, actually important thing to notice, is that each subject presents itself as a signifier. Can you grasp that without I'm saying any more? Yes?
So can you unpack subject a bit? So you said that each signifier presents a subject in the course of a conversation, and you said that that's a subjectivity getting divided. Can you talk about a little more about what that means?
Well, that's pretty complicated. Let me just turn the tables here for a second to maybe illuminate also what you asked for. Because each subject presents itself as a signifier. Okay? I mean, you have identity papers, you have social recognition, and you have so-called iconic figures. I mean, Einstein is one, and Donald Duck is another, and so on and so forth. And yeah, they are all subjects. Even in fairy tales, the characters are subjects, of course, because they speak. So, does that in any way illuminate your question?
Well, it's hard because it seems like I don't know how to differentiate subject from signifier here.
No, this is what I just said here. In other words, the subject presents itself also as a signifier.
So it's not presenting so alpha or whatever is presenting alpha is the difference as opposed to presenting beta. Is that?
This is sort of a formalization, trying to clean up a little bit what they are doing, Lacan and Freud. So they will say this is too sparse. This doesn't cover it. But I like to start at this level and then fill in the parts that are lacking. Instead of starting from top down, I try to go bottom up. Because that way you can keep check of what you are doing better. So this whole thing is of course very paradoxical and very nebulous, and it's hard to find anybody who really understands this topic. But the thing is that it's a topic in development. In other words, we are all responsible for developing this topic if we want to learn anything from it. It is not given to us ready-made. So maybe I can now give you a little more meat on the subject here. It is very easy to see now how ethics interferes with aesthetics. Namely, not every possible subject is allowed. In fact, there are subjects who are forbidden as they display or embody forbidden signifiers, in the sense that the subject presents itself as a signifier. I mean, take a criminal, take anybody you don't like. That sort of is an illustration of this in a dramatic way. In fact, there are subjects who are forbidden as they display or embody forbidden signifiers. The forbidden subject represents zones of forbidden signifiers, which is to say, zones of repressed signification, the transgression of which defines some form or other of perversion. More generally, it follows that there exist forbidden objects and forbidden actions, the relations to which must be repressed or resisted by a subject in good standing. So, the subject is simply the speaking subject. It has to be distinguished from what is called the ego, das Ich, in Freud, is very different from das Ich. is also very different from the unconscious and other technical notions like that. Nevertheless, it interacts with all of them and depends on all of them. So, yeah, so now I come to the actual technical part here. Okay, that's one. So I have to introduce a new kind of semantics which I call aspectual semantics. So I already mentioned to you that the set of sentences in English grammar is a recursively enumerable set. But also the Freudian denotation, the signifier, may also exhibit recursively enumerable sets. So the idea is something like this. How do I do it? So I have a sound object X. So I just make it in this index there. And then this sound object is on top of a tree. So, and the tree has various branches like this. Okay, and the what is called the Vorstellungsrepräsentanz is the aspect of meaning of the sound object X. So I use simply VRX for Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. So among the possible assignments of meanings here, or rather signifiers, I should say, this is the one that is chosen for this sound object. It can be anyone, it depends on the context. And the other ones I call dormant aspects or dormant denotations. Okay? And it is only, so to speak, when you take the dormant denotations into account that the full meaning of the signifiers will be exposed. And these dormant aspects are important then in the case of a transformation between what is called Heimlich and Unheimlich. Because although this has to do with affect and anxiety, you may think this is taking place in the imaginary dimension, but it's actually only in the symbolic dimension. This is sort of the main discovery in psychoanalysis, that anxiety and affect is simply a problem with signification. Okay, so if I do this, what is the time?
It's a
do
little
I
bit
go
after
over
4.
time?
It's okay, just keep going.
Okay.
It's about 4.
supposed to be more or less equivalent, except now that what happens is that the Vorstellung Repräsentanz has moved from one of the dormant, from this indication here to one of the dormant ones. Okay? And oh, I should also indicate the infinity here. So in other words, this can go down all the way. So you have to understand that the dormant aspects here are like synonyms, definite descriptions, and all kinds of other linguistic means used to denotate this sound object X. So you can do that in any number of ways. And the funny thing about, say, repression or something like that is that it has to do with the choice of this part. So in other words, if you have a sound object that you are allergic to, that means that you have a specific meaning aspect of it is given. And when you have overcome that, that means that the Vorstellung Repräsentanz, the aspect has moved to another branch of this construction. And that is all that happens. You just get another word for it and you are okay. Well, but, you know, this is why this is interesting. So this is how a single sound, so this can be a single sound, and it can change as a signifier, as a function of change of aspect. So you have a redistribution of meaning that resides in the signifier. And I don't know if you are familiar with my music, but I have some compositions where continuous change of aspect along an unchanging continuous sound is very important. So I have a constant sound, and you start to listen to it, and you find one aspect to it, and an hour later it's the same sound. I mean, it has no beginning, no end. You start to think maybe differently about it. And so there is a change of aspect. And the sound has not changed. What has changed is you, your mind. And you express that by having a new aspect attached to the sound. So in discourse semantics, for each signifier S, there exists a variety of aspects or Vorstellungsrepräsentanzen adopted by the speaking subject. And in general, each subject chooses a denotational value distinct from any other subject, where the choice depends on the history of the subject. And I now come to, I have to write more here now to give you, this is sort of what I've been working up towards. It now comes what I actually wanted to try to say. So now I have to write again. Let's see how I do this. Actually, I know what I will do, which is not this. Well, I usually work on a blackboard, so this is sort of the version I'm actually using. So I'm now interested in the forbidden zones of signification. fixing the object that is Unheimlich. It can also be an action, but to not make too much writing. And so I call it object U for Unheimlich, and it's connected with its appearance. Then we have to fix the signifier. So I abbreviate that like that, and that is simply I write the signifier for object U without underlining. So and the last thing we need to fix is the aspect of Vorstellungsrepresentanz. So the VRU. And actually, I wrote that like that. Then we have to do the same for the Unheimlich. So what I'm doing now, I'm setting up for the discussion I'm going to have with Bill about how this is now. Oh yeah, so the signifier is of course sound. So, and then we have the Hennix. Well, I should say that was what's wrong. Allowed songs. Signification. So I abbreviate signification like that. And then we have Unheimlich. Oh yeah, so there should actually be a little bit of arrows here. I forgot to do that. So here is an arrow, here is an arrow. And the point with this arrow is that it is extraordinary. And so we are fixing the object here. So for Heinrich that become then object A. And this is ordinary. Okay. And then we go to the signifier. And down here we have the Vorstellungsrepresentanz or the aspect. So what Bill and I have been debating for some time is how you tame the extraordinary, taming the extraordinary by redistributing the values assigned to the dormant aspects of it. And well, as you may sense at this stage, that the symbolic dimension is actually a phantasm. Not only the imaginary dimension for Lacan is a phantasm, but also the notations. In other words, the reason that you all have different Vorstellungsrepresentanten or aspects of a signifier is precisely because we have a phantasm about how the signifier denotes. Okay? Everyone has their own idea for a signifier, how it denotes. I mean, that's how poetry works, other things, misunderstandings, of course, as well. So it is a question now about traversing this denotational phantasm of signification by cessation of resistance to the rebirth of a signifier under an aspect transformation. And the paradigmatic example would be the reception of certain avant-garde music. Okay, when people throw the programs at the composer and boo it out, I mean, when it's the total failure. That is sort of because it is perceived as Unheimlich. Then 10 years later, there's a classical piece. Everybody's applauding. It's played next to Beethoven. What happened? I mean, the sound didn't change. Same sound. But now it is accepted as totally Heimlich. And this is sort of something that is, to me, very difficult to understand, really. And I think for most people. And Bill and I have been trying to sort this out. So far not to our satisfaction. But we hope that by communicating this intellectual struggle that we have, we can get input from other people who can maybe help us with traversing this phantasm. So, Bill, do you like to say something now?
I can. I don't want to. I think we have so many. We've gone through so many terms and things. I don't want to complicate things further, but in a certain way, Lacan always was calling for this return to Freud. So I have spent some time in the last few days rereading the original Unheimlich text, and I think what might be helpful in this discussion is that later in Freud's text he makes a distinction between two kinds of Unheimlichkeit. And maybe one should also, maybe I could just very, very quickly try to talk about a simple rendition of the Freudian Unheimlich, which has to do with when one sees something uncanny, when one sees something a bit spooky or scary, with a repressed recognition of something which before one entered into the symbolic order, when one was being inscribed into this system of signification, perceptions that one had that were forbidden, that are through the process of acquiring language and accepting the authority of the family, one learns what is allowed. So, for example, there are different examples. And this is why Freud makes two distinctions. There's for example, people, like a good example of something Unheimlich is like a puppet, that people are afraid of dolls or toys or things, as though they were somehow possessed of life. And Freud's comment is that this is not because one is actually afraid that they are alive, but rather it's this kind of deferred remembrance of a point from infantile experience when one actually did believe that these things were alive. That he talks about animism and this kind of infantile animistic narcissism, in which the ego and the self were not differentiated from the outside world so clearly anymore. And in the case of something like, in this specific case of something like animistic, something like very benign, like just looking at a puppet or a doll and having this uncanny moment of thinking it's spooky. He says that this is one kind of uncanniness that we can very easily get over, because it's one that through the process of we've learned through this kind of process of signification to reality check our things. We can immediately say, oh no, we know better. It's not real. We're distinct from that. There's another process of uncanniness that he describes, however, that has to do with a kind of more traumatic recovery of a moment of repression. And this he attributes more, for example, to objects like like severed limbs or severed heads and things like this, that refer to. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole Freudian thing, but that refer to ideas of castration and lack, and the kind of violence of becoming a part of the symbolic order. And these are kind of repressive moments which, when reactivated in their recognition of something uncanny, cannot be so easily reality checked, in which there is some kind of rupture that cannot be entirely accounted for insofar as it refers to a kind of primary rupture. So, trying to return this a little bit, or more, maybe just more to the example that Christopher is mentioning in relation to the reception of contemporary
Can you
music.
stay loud? Is this pretty loud?
This is getting louder?
Stand up.
I don't know if is there another microphone?
There's a mic over there.
Are these on? Are these on? Oh, they are on. No, I can just go like this. That my wondering, however, was if this problem of artistic work, or in this case musical work, making some kind of apparent shift from being something Unheimlich to Heimlich, was not so much this registral shift, but rather a registral shift between these two different registers of the Unheimlich. And what I mean there is that this system, which Christopher, and this is, please answer me that, as I would understand it, which is described here, one has to situate as a single sort of system of representation, or a kind of normative system of representation. This is a representation of the kind of functioning of the given symbolic order which one comes into. And in that sense, a new work, or a new musical work, is, this term sort of stands for a kind of given foreshadowing representanz. But in that sense, it is also a totally changeable, shiftable entity along this tree. That it is simply a component within this given structure. So that the initial appearance of Unheimlichkeit has more to do with simply a kind of surface or material unfamiliarity that is perhaps a new, what is your term? sort of a new activation of a dormant aspect along this tree, but which still fully participates within the structure of switching between tree branches, so to speak. And however, all of that in relation to these terms, Unheimlich, I would actually relate to, in Freud's text, this level of what he talks about of overcome Unheimlichkeit, at the level of the puppet, at the level of these kind of non-threatening instances within a given totally bounded symbolic field. The question, however, of this other kind of Unheimlichkeit, which is something in which one is kind of thrown back to this sort of other kind of primal repression, I think would have to be formulated in relation to art in a much more fundamental way, in the sense of a rearrangement of the actual system of signification, of the way these branch things function and relate. Because this other system of Unheimlichkeit, you had some other diagrams which I think you didn't draw, but would be a kind of shortcut between the conscious and the unconscious, which also in Freudian terms is like what they refer to as jouissance.
Yeah, so what you have here is a diagram that sometimes can commute. So U for unconscious, C for consciousness, and A, oh, it's N for action. No. Oh, I need a microphone.
Yeah, or here, just take this.
This is a diagram that is sort of giving a schematic overview of the way information travels in your mind according to psychoanalysis. So you have a information flow going from the unconscious to consciousness. The consciousness is continuously modified or modulated by unconscious movements. Consciousness is usually responsible for our actions, and they are in public space. But the unconscious and consciousness are both in invisible spaces, so nobody can check what is going on here. But yeah, and so we also have unconscious actions, of course, but then there is also back reaction, so the consciousness can work on the unconscious as well. And so can actions. And this sort of gets more and more complicated. But I would like to say that there is a third form of in between the two that you mentioned from Freud, the Unheimlichkeit with the puppet and Unheimlichkeit with the traumatic experience. Because when you reject the piece of modern music, it is neither, I think. It is more complex. If you think about how many people relate to inanimate objects, they speak to them. I mean, when your car stalls, you speak to the car, you ask it to do something. Or when your computer fucks up, you speak to your computer, and you admit that that is not really objects, no, I'm losing everything. I have a wait here because of a microphone. When a piece of music or art or a piece of literature is rejected, it's because it's not just aesthetically problematic. It breaks all the rules of aesthetics that you expect. But there is an ethical breach too. In other words, someone who does this is not in good standing anymore. You become a notoriety for doing strange things or whatever. And this is another type of Unheimlichkeit, I think, the two that you mentioned. Or what do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's also complicated because I think we haven't actually, of all the things we've talked about, we've created this kind of more or less clear formal framework, but we haven't talked about the status of what establishes something as forbidden or something as allowed. And this is a very complicated place. This is where the question of a kind of gendered subject and things like this become very important and critical again, because this kind of traumatic experience of lack that we're talking about in Freud and Lacan is always the signifier that divides the subject is the phallus, which I'm trying to think of the quickest way to describe this. Which maybe in our case, it's actually for our terms of discussion today, is to replace it with the term that you turned me on to from Serge Leclerc, that instead of using the phallus, which is this problematic term that has this kind of implications of a biologistic kind of identification of the penis and the phallus and insist on this kind of gender differentiation of lack and the establishment of the system of signification. Serge Leclerc refers instead to, he tries to sort of have a more formal term, which is the unconscious referent. I was thinking though, of another way of trying to describe this issue of the transformation of a sort of unknown or at one moment appearing Unheimlich object in art and music into something else, as also has to do with kind of, we could say, over time, this separation between the Vorstellungsrepräsentanz, that is between the privileged signifier along the chain of potential signification and the sound object. And that perhaps when John Cage in 1958 is making a particular piece, this sound object that's kind of beginning from a certain potentials and the establishment of that particular Vorstellungsrepräsentanz, over time comes to sort of stand in the place of this sound object. And so that after generations and generations, what remains no longer has any relation at all to the sound object, but rather to the kind of stylistic element of the specific Vorstellungsresponse representanz, which has sort of sedimented over time.
Yeah, to elaborate on this example of Bill's, see, what I wanted to do for you today was to show you some open questions in music theory. I have no solutions to them, but I think it is a good idea that people work on solutions to these problems. So let me refocus what the topic really is. So we do have the sound object. And let me just represent it to begin with a straight line. just the usual conventional composition, which has a beginning here, and it ends over here, okay? Any composition you can choose. So there is first one global meaning of the composition given by the title or whatever, which covers the entire line. Then you may have smaller parts here, like melodic sequences or harmonic progressions or anything else within here that also has meaning. But notice now that, there is not a single textbook in music theory that can give you the meaning of any given composition, even when it is program music, pictures of an exhibition by Mussorgsky or something. I mean, nobody believes that that is what the music is about. And also when we come to smaller parts of this whole composition, there is a lack of a semantic component here that is coherent. Nobody can really tell you what the meaning of parts of it is. And so this is an open research arena for anybody who is ambitious to try to figure out how we actually come to some type of understanding of what semantics can be for music. And here different styles of music may have different kinds of grammar and semantics. All of this has to be sorted out. I mean, it's not sorted out. But I think it is an important question, and it is an open question, and therefore it invites a study. And since you all study music here, I thought it might be nice for you to learn about a topic that you wouldn't learn about otherwise. So, that is sort of...
I think we should take questions.
Okay. All right. So that is what I was going to do next, actually. But this is an inexhaustible subject matter just to state the problem. I can go on all night here before I give you the word. So let's skip that part and do some questions.
In a sense, in the example you took of program music, musical practice is kind of an attempt to create a sound composition which consists precisely of pre-existence.
You said musical bank?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well,
It's an attempt to solve that problem in a sense.
yeah, it is, but what do you think of the solution? How successful was it? That is my question.
I have quite a few questions, probably because I didn't understand everything you said. But one of the things that I was curious about is this shifting of what you call it, the aspect. The German name was, and how you're able to some kind of move it through the trees through either familiarity or some kind of uncovering aspect. And you said, for instance, so I was kind of curious if the shift from the Unheimlich to the Heimlich actually happens through that motion of the aspect through dormant notation. Is that how it moves from one category to the other? From some kind of moving through these dormant spaces?
Yeah, so in particular, this is sort of are you familiar with Lacan's idea about the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real? Yeah, you all know that. So what is important here is that all of this takes place in the symbolic dimension. So it's not just fantasy, imaginary. It's actually the symbolic that is being modified, because it's the denotation that is being modified. Okay, so the object itself is perfectly inert, perfectly peaceful. The problem is the signification that has been given to it. The signifier, the symbolization of the object, that is the problem. So if you symbolize the same object slightly differently, it's okay. But there are particular ways of symbolizing the object that become what Lacan calls object, something you can deal with. And it's rejected as something that your system is not capable of processing.
But I guess the question that somehow is not directly related to that is, do you think that music needs semantics?
No, not really, but scientists keep saying that it has a semantics because the composer says this music has meaning. In other words, no composer stands up and says, my music is meaningless. Yeah, no, we all claim it has meaning. And now the question is, so what was the meaning? And here everybody's struggling back.
Maybe the meaning is simply defined relationally. This sort of logical tree that you developed here reminds me a lot of Kubler's sketch of art history, except that for Kubler, it's a simple each change in the sort of, let's say, the art historical calculus is simply an accretion onto a pre-existing branch. In a way, what you're talking about is, and it is recursively numerable as well. What you're talking about, and I think explaining in a very interesting way, is that nobody exactly knows how that extension happens. It's kind of unpredictable, or should we say uncanny, in the passage from the unfamiliar, which is also familiar, to something which becomes familiar as it's kind of as it enters consciousness from the unconscious.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not familiar with the author that you mentioned.
I'm talking about it's a book called The Shape of Time. I think it's George Kubler.
I don't know it.
Might be worth a look.
Okay. Thank you. Well, it's just that if somebody claims that we have meaning to something, you ask, okay, nice, so what's the meaning? If there is no answer, that is disappointing.
But maybe it's an answer which can't be. Maybe it's an answer which only exists relationally. That it's not a quantum, or it's not something which can be expressed by a simple recursive extension of terms.
That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. But we won't feel uncomfortable with that answer, I think. In other words, there should be a better answer.
Maybe.
But there could be a better answer.
I was going to say something very close to that. I was just going to ask, when you're speaking about the lack of meaning for music,
No, I don't speak of lack of meaning of music, I speak about
well,
lack of
undefinability.
explicit meaning.
Right. So I was trying to get my head around whether you have, when you're saying that if you have a specific linguistic meaning in mind, is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about
No, much
finding
more,
other ways
much
to
more general, yeah, much
say
more general.
signify or non-linguistic?
Yeah. Well, my own music is usually, if I may speak of my own music, I consider it as being basically non-figurative, just pure syntax. And so the meaning doesn't come into my music. But as I say, other people claim meaning, and I ask them, so what was it? And I don't get a good answer. So that is part of why it's provoked this approach. Chuck?
Too many questions.
What time is it? Oh, we have a bit of time.
What time was it?
It's like 4:45.
Okay, great. Well, let me ask, let me tell you. Okay.
In the tree with the dormant aspects and the favored aspects, do you consider that the dormant aspects at any given one moment are in some sense determinate, or are they themselves undergoing subliminal transformation as the dominant aspect moves among them?
Well, that is a complicated question, maybe. The way I think about it is that you construct this tree bit by bit. So in other words, the tree is not given to you initially, but because of the recursive mode of thought in which this is generated, you can go down branch by branch by branch, and you add new constructions at each level. So in other words, first you have just one, there is just one meaning, which is the Vorstellungsrepresentanz, the aspect. Then you learn that there are all kinds of definite descriptions that describe the same object. Then you have synonyms, you have other ways of expressing the same notion. And as you acquire those abilities, you keep expanding this tree. In other words, even if you haven't counted up to say the number 2633, when I mention it to you, it is clear which number I mean. Because you can quickly construct every number from 1 up to that number, okay, recursively. So in that sense, these are potential meanings, you could say, which may not have arrived yet, but they are arrivable in the sense that you can construct them. Is there a need for it?
But just to kind of return to what I was...
There's a question back there.
Just quickly what I was trying to hint at a little bit before, what seems a little bit absent in this discussion is that these trees are also, it's not just like totally arbitrary. There are certain sort of cultural, normative, learned privilegings of members of this tree. So it's not just this kind of infinite play of equal terms. I mean, in the case of a sound object, it's complicated, but that's why I'm just wondering more about that. Maybe what needs to be clarified is also, even if one is trying to differentiate from it, what in Freud or Lacan they refer to as the Oedipal process of Oedipalization, which is a process whereby the subject is split, so to speak, and how specifically that occurs, which has then to do with this distinction between what is forbidden and what is allowed. So that very obviously in Freud and Lacan there's a kind of heteronormative, cis-normative bias to the specific aspects which are privileged or not.
Yes, indeed. There was a question back here.
I don't know. It had more to do with the way I'll just speak up. The way the conversation kind of started off with thinking about the mind as this object that's unidentifiable or unlocatable, and the entire time kind of following you through this, I kept thinking about maybe as the mind as process and or like a shared object that is very much alive, and so this tree diagram and things kind of shifting and I'm not totally sure I fully grasp it, but the part of the problem, at least for me, might be solved in the sense that the mind is not an organ in the way that the brain is an organ that serves its functions, or kind of thoughts about the way like biochemistry industries work, kind of giving us drugs that prevent certain things to be produced in our body to prevent, whatever, depression and these things, and that maybe the soul can also be looked at this way in terms of like the mind is something that's evolving and shared, and the meaning is something that's fluid and flexible, whereas the brain maybe acts or reacts in a more like mechanistic way. So just in terms of like looking for meaning with music, that it's not necessarily something that could be, well, I don't know, I guess I'm trailing off, but just back to the mind is something that's not within our body, but it's something that's like an ongoing process among us, as you kind of point out in this topic.
Yeah, what I wanted to emphasize with this type of presentation was that usually the subject is considered to be invariable, constant, even undivided. So, yeah, because the scientist, if he's divided, he cannot be a reliable experimental person. He cannot conduct experiments unless he remains the same while the experiment is progressive, okay? So the scientist has to pretend that he's the same person when he started the experiment as when it's over. What I'm trying to say here, that doesn't work here. You have to allow for the subject, for the mind and the brain to keep changing. If you think about computer architecture, for instance, you buy your laptop, right? And that is sort of in some sense the hardwire of your brain, but your real brain are the programs that you run on it. You understand? In other words, without a program, your computer is useless. And the computer simply can reconfigure itself depending on which program you that run on it and what inputs you use. See? So the laptop is a very variable thing. It's not a constant thing, unless you only have one program in it. Okay? Do you see what I'm trying to explain?
Sure.
Okay. So that is the whole point here, that most people don't understand that the computer and the mind and the brain are not constant, but they are continuously modifying themselves depending on the context in which they are operating.
I'm wondering if you might articulate once again the difference between the underlined object and the one that is not underlined. I'm not sure I understand the process moving from Unheimlich and Heimlich as well, moving to and furthermore, this object H, I'm familiar with the petite object A.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering where the context for the petite object A might belong in this conversation.
Oh, it belongs in the Unheimlich section.
Unheimlich.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah, you're right. Okay.
Yeah, well, this semiotics is of course not specified sufficiently, so I underline simply object in order to just show that that is the object without a signifier. And then you have to choose a signifier for it, and that is the part that is not underlined.
I see. So it's the object before signification.
Yeah, or you have the freedom of maybe choosing more than one signifier for it.
I don't know if this is relevant, but I can't help but wonder about issues of taste or value in terms of what's good and bad, and perhaps it's based on signifiers that are related to good things or criteria to make good sounds or good music, versus, I don't know if it plays into the forbidden zones or allowed zones, but
Yeah, it does very much, indeed. That is the core of the whole problem, really. Yeah. I mean, what is bad, what is good. But that is not necessarily aesthetics, you see,
yeah.
because it's not a preference relation. What is a preference relation? It's an ethical law. Okay? So ethics is about, I mean, something is good or something is bad is an ethical question. Then if you prefer bad to good, that is an aesthetical question.
And which would you consider the opting for this model of mind to be?
Pardon?
The opting for this model of mind?
Opting?
The choice for this model of mind that you kind of laid out for us, would you consider that to be an aesthetic or an ethical judgment?
Well, I guess unfortunately it remains on the aesthetical level still, because you didn't walk out on me, so it was okay. No, but I mean, no, but look, if we do this for real, not many people may remain here actually, because this topic is, somewhat repulsive.
I'm gonna try this one more time just quickly. If the claim is that music is meaningless, what is the criterion of meaningfulness? In other words, what's the criterion by which we establish whether or not, what's the test of meaningfulness?
Well, gee, I mean, first of all, I did not postulate that music was meaningless, but that is, that is not a question I can answer in the 5 minutes that is left. No, but the point is that there are claims about meaning of music. And I simply want to put those claims in this context and then ask the question again, what is the meaning of music?
I have a related question. I think it has to do with your establishing this sort of semantic infinity of possibilities and of what's the index of what did you call those little branches on the tree?
The dormant aspects?
Yeah, the dormant aspects. It kind of stemmed from there because I'm confused why these dormant aspects stem from the sound object as opposed to the listener or the viewer or whatever we're going to use. And that also triggers the relationship between the ascribing those characteristics to the viewer versus the semantic infinity of combinations, because viewers aren't infinite and die and expire and change. And so I guess I'm wondering what the consequence of all this, those possibilities are in relation to that. It seems like, I don't know, inconsequential. Or just simply invented by the system which you've imputed into music.
No, but see, language is a system all by itself, which allows for these structures to unfold. And they have nothing to do with your original experiences. In other words, what you are trying to do with your original experiences is to map them onto this system of semiotics in order to speak about it. And this mapping is a very controversial thing. In other words, how do you actually do a good mapping here? I mean, that is what the artists are involved with sometimes.
This is just a comment mostly, but I kept thinking about the work that George Lewis is doing, a kind of like the historical materialist reading of free jazz to a certain extent, and that's like seems like one approach to trying to find meaning in music, which is like has to do with history as contextual, and then talking about how players would actually improvise in the sense that they were, sending messages of some kind or another when they improvised together.
Yeah. I mean, this is black culture in particular you were speaking about. And I mean, they have their own system of communication. I mean, they know what they are doing.
Yeah, I'd like you to expound more on why. Could you expound more on why you said that experimental music failed somehow in the ability to unravel hidden aspects of the mind, or even probably to some kind of move from the Unheimlich to the Heimlich? Because you said yourself in your own music, which I'm sorry to say, I'm looking forward to listen to more, that you are actually trying to somehow move this kind of perceptions of creating some kind of a tone which allows this kind of shifting of interpretation. So in that way, I would say that just by using that, there is a form of success of moving from the Unheimlich to the Heimlich. But then earlier you said that it failed. So did I misunderstand what you said?
No, but look, I know of no composer who is asking these questions. In other words, for no textbook in composition raises these questions.
Yeah, but no textbook does not mean no composers.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm not as educated as I should be, perhaps. But yeah, I'm not aware of any composer who is interested in this. I have met a few. I try to raise this topic, and they say this is not what they are interested in.
I don't know about, yeah, she, go. As a sort of indirect way of trying to respond to that, what I was maybe trying a little bit earlier to say is that so much, especially in music in the historical avant-garde, has been, if we're using the system at the level of simply sort of switching between dormant, between which thing in this chart is privileged. And I think that the kind of shift that Christer is trying to articulate has to do rather with changing the relationship between the subject and the syntax. That like as you described your own work in this idea of a sound which stays constant, but that your relation to it changes. And in sort of insisting on this level, it's insisting on a syntactical difference rather than a semantic difference, where these dormant things would be individual semantic particles or something. It's not the right word, but and you're suggesting, as I understand it, a kind of turn to the syntactical.
Yeah, in other words, sounds which don't require interpretation. But you see, already in the case of speaking regular words, we have the possibility of misunderstanding each other. Okay? So already here you have so in other words, also in music, two people hear the same piece, but they understand two different things by it. And in cognitive science, this is used by scientists to try to somehow find out how the mind works. And then you would think, okay, so the composers must be the first row here, because they are doing this all the time. So if we want to find out how music influences the mind, the best person to go to is the composer. But that is not true. And I find that somewhat paradoxical, especially in the 21st century, the century of science. So I feel that composers should be more familiar with science, and in that way they may find that these questions are more interesting than otherwise.
So a composer that's working with like autoacoustic emissions might be leaning towards this form of composition that you're talking about?
I would think so, yes.
So it becomes more of dealing with aural phenomena instead of some kind of aesthetic choice in the compositional.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, well, I mean, not all over the board, of course, but that is one particular line of development that I find very interesting. And I also find the present situation in experimental music very depressing, in the sense that I never hear anything interesting. And so to overcome this obstacle of I mean, there is a stagnation, there's no question about it, between, what people did in the 50s and 60s and what's been going on for the last 30 years. And why do we have this stagnation? Well, maybe part of it is because people don't ask these questions. Maybe many compositions would never have been made had these questions been on the table. I mean, people would have realized that maybe I shouldn't compose this way, or I shouldn't have this composition, etc., etc. There are too many compositions out there, no question.
It's a little after 5. I'm just announcing I have to go soon, but
Oh.
I wish we could continue.
Yeah, see, this is a one semester course, really. I mean, this is a teaser that we got today. I couldn't do better, but I thought it was still interesting for me to give you an idea about that this is a possible way of thinking, and this is how I, as a composer, have been thinking most of my life. But I found very few people were interested in this way of thinking. So I don't know if you have to run to another class or something like that, but I don't know, shall we end now or?
Yeah, thank you. If you could just maybe stay here.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but where is this villa? Or where
It starts at 6:30.
Yeah, but where is it?
It's close by. We want someone to drive.
Well, we have to be there. It's so far.
Well, we could walk. It's 2 minutes walk. Oh, wonderful. Hi. No. There's a dinner tonight at Leon Boston's house. No. I have to run to a meeting. I'll be back within an hour. Okay. Of course. Yes, sir. Yes.